Well, today's show, we are continuing the celebration of Quincy Jones turning 90 years young.
Join us today for Celebrating the Dude, a tribute to Quincy Jones, Part 2, with our special guest, Ed Eckstine.
I'm Monique Kelly, and this is Music Day, a verified hit. This is a podcast all about trends and issues facing the Black music business, unapologetic conversations that will inspire and educate people. You can get Music Day anywhere where you get your podcasts: Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, and iHeartRadio. And we're doing things a little differently again. We are speaking to a man that has known Quincy and worked with him for decades. I'm talking about Ed Eckstine. So we're going to just dive in because I'm so excited to have you here today, Ed. You are the son of Billy Eckstine. You toured with your dad as a child during school breaks, wrote for Soul magazine, joined Quincy's production company at 19 years old, headed Polygram's Wing Records with Miss America Vanessa Williams, became the president of Mercury Records, the first African-American at a non-Black owned label. So my first question for you, Ed, well, first of all, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And my first question to you is, did your position as head of Mercury rekindle the memory of Quincy Jones, as he was the first Black person to head the A&R department of a major non-Black label at Mercury Records? He produced It's My Party by Leslie Gore, and you became the first Black head of that same major label. Did the two of you ever discuss or reflect on that full circle moment?
The notion wasn't lost on me. I was well aware of the fact that he was the first, Black vice president of A&R and one of the major labels. Because when I worked for him, it was a conversation on a number of occasions where he would reference it to something, tying something in business-wise. And also, my father had recorded for Mercury. Quincy produced and arranged for my dad when he was there. So it was like a full circle moment, my dad having been an artist there, my mentor having been an executive there, and then ultimately I took over the reins. But, one thing really had nothing to do with the other than the fact that it was serendipitous in that respect.
And Ed, tell me a little about those early years when you were touring with your dad, first of all, and then joining Quincy's production company. What was that entire experience like, from childhood to being 19 years old joining this production company?
Well, the relationship, my father toured basically 40 weeks a year. He was on the road a lot. And during the summer months, he had a series of dates that he played. He would play the Catskills, the Jewish resorts up in the Catskills. There'd be like a 4 to 6 week period up there where he'd do one-nighters at the various hotels up there. And then we switch over to like the Poconos, where there were, other resorts. So most of the school year he was touring. So in the summers, the family would pack up the station wagon and do a trip cross country, stopping in Chicago to see my mom's family, stopping in Pittsburgh to see dad's, ending up in the Catskills, where Pops would do, 4 weeks in the Catskills, maybe 2 more in the Poconos, and then another 6 weeks of so-called Chitlin circuit theaters, the Baron, the Howard, the Apollo, etc. And that's where he kind of demystified the business for us, because, growing up, most of the kids, when I grew up, didn't know who my dad was. You get that sort of taunting, your dad's famous, but I don't know who he is. And their parents would make a big deal out of it, because most of the parents grew up on Billy Eckstine records. He was of their generation. So more often than not, there was like, it was a big deal. And one of the things that Pops tried to do for us to make us understand, because, those kind of moments where, you play Little League ball or basketball, football, whatever, you say, Dad, I hit a home run today, whatever, scored a touchdown. You wish he wasn't there because he was on the road. You wished he was there. And our only times when he was on the road that we could connect was he would check in, once a week, and we talked to him on the phone and sort of give the update. And one of the things that he impressed to my brothers and I was, I'm no different than anybody else. Just my name happens to be in lights. I wish I could be doing what your friend whose father is in the metal business metal business or whatever the case may be, but this is what I do. And the fact that it's up in lights, people make that more special. So he demystified the business for us by sort of teaching us the game. To that extent, I guess I'm in the current nomenclature, I'm a Nepo baby. Because in our household, showbiz was family business. We sit around the table. Stuff that got talked about was show business. If your parents were teachers, they talked about teacher stuff. So, one of the things he did to demystify is we all had gigs on the tour during the summer. And it started off with one of the things that the first stage was putting the music on the stands. He taught us that. He and his accompanist, he had a guy called Bobby Tucker, who was his piano player for 50 years. And Tuck would teach us how to set up the stands, music on the stands. So if you put the third saxophone player's part on the trombone player's stand in the middle of the songs, he turned the page. If the wrong music was there, all hell was going to break loose. And Pops or Tuck weren't going to be happy. So we sort of learned how to cover things thoroughly. That was the first phase. The second gig was being, he never wore the same thing in the same city twice. So when he'd come off the stage, he'd take his tuxedo or his suit or whatever off, and it would be on the floor. You picked it up and stuck it in the laundry bag and made sure that it got to the cleaners the next day. So sort of valet-like, if you will. And then it sort of, you elevated to greeter, where we'd wear our own little tuxedo and suit backstage. And a lot of those gigs, when you come off the stage, 20 minutes after being off the stage, you'd go back out and sign autographs, take pictures. So, we'd sort of walk back out to where the people were. My dad will be back out in 20 minutes to say, so you never really have the families. Oh my God, that's your son, So he did that. So we really learned how to, that the fans were our lifeblood. The fans were ones who really, the lovely house and the way we were raised and all that kind of stuff that was afforded us came as a direct result of the people that were backstage, that were there waiting for him to come out and take pictures. So that's how the business got demystified. So one particular summer, 1961, I was to be 8 years old that year, so 7 during the summer. He was on the road it was Dad, the Quincy Jones Orchestra, Nipsey Russell and Red Fox, depending on which venue it was in, were the comedians. The Four Tops were his background singers. And Frida Payne was the girl singer with Quincy's orchestra. And Colson Atkins, Honey Colson, Charlie Atkins being famous as the Motown choreographer, and Honey being, they were two well-renowned tap dancers, were the dance act on the show. So, we'd go out and they were doing 4 or 5 shows a day in places like the Apollo. And when my dad was loved to play golf. He played golf constantly. He was a scratch. Played pretty much 72 holes of golf, 36 holes of golf every day. And most of my life, he only worked warm weather climates. So he played 36 holes. But when you're a kid, last thing you want to do is sort of hang out on a golf course, because I didn't play golf. So Quincy sort of became big brother / Uncle Q. When I saw him out there as like a 7-year-old, and Quincy's 20 years older than me. So he's 27 years old at that point. And there's summers, some of those gigs, Pops was, going out, and we'd end up either in the hotel hanging out with Mom, or Quincy at that point was doing a lot of what they call clinics. He would go to various music stores where they're in different cities, whatever company was his sponsor for his horn, or he would go do clinics for young arrangers and stuff. And my family calls me Bugs. We all have family nicknames. My Bugs. And so, one point Q said, "Hey, Bugs, you want to come hang out with me today? I got to go to the store." And third, yeah, sure. So, I ended up hanging out with him doing that. And that started, he became like sort of big brother / uncle, / whatever, family. And that translated to years later. I hadn't, that was what I said. I'm 7 years old, 7, 8, 9 years old. And then I went away to school, blah, 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 and became a teenager. And then when I was like 18, I was writing for a magazine out here called Phonograph Record Magazine. And I got a call one day from the head of publicity at A&M Records, a sister named Billy Spencer, another woman named Dee Dee McNeil, called me and asked me would I be interested in writing a story about Quincy. He had just completed his album Body Heat. And it was going to be a career change and a transition for him musically and where he was going musically. As I came to find out years later, Quincy shed skin every, sort of 7 to 10 years on a number of levels. Would I be interested in doing this piece with him? I said, yeah, sure. Let me hear the record. So they sent me the record, and I loved it. Body Heat's a great album, still one of my favorite records.
Oh.
And they loved the record, and they said, well, here's his number. Give him a call, see, put together when you guys can do the interview. So I called him. Bugs, how you doing, man? How you been? You know, he hadn't seen me since, I was a little kid. Here I was 18, 19 years old at that point. And he said, yeah, man, I'd love to talk to you about the record. He said, I'm doing a gig. He and his big band at that point, Disneyland, used to do weekend concerts during the summer on the Tomorrowland stage with big bands. Basie did it, Ellington Band, and then Quincy had a band. He was doing his big band gig there at Disneyland. And this was the last phase of him shedding that particular skin. So he said, meet me down in the A&M recording studio a lot. We're going to be, the band bus will be there. We're going down to Disneyland. Meet me there at 6 o'clock on Saturday, whatever. I met him there at 6 o'clock on Saturday. Of course, me being who I was, a knucklehead at the time, I was a little bit like 15 minutes late. And when I got there, the musicians were all these sort of crusty brothers who had all alumnus of either Hamp's band or Ellington's band or Basie's band, all of whom knew my pops from back in the day. And they were all out here at that point because one of the things a lot of folks don't know, that most, like the Johnny Carson Orchestra, the Merv Griffin Orchestra, a number of the orchestras in the studios out here, a lot of those great musicians who were in those bands during back in the day ended up in those TV and studio bands out here. And so just to sort of get their thing off, they would, do like the Quincy gig or somebody's gig so they could play on a Saturday night and jam and solo and all that stuff. So I get on the bus. I had, big crazy ass afro. Bus, and Quincy says to everybody, they're all kind of grumbling because they, who's this brother's late and that kind of thing. Or who's this? You can imagine what the words were they used. And Quincy says to me, he says, man, y'all know who this is? And they all kind of looked at him like, no, we don't know who that long wild ending is. Who is he? And they said, that's Beat. And they, oh my goodness, and then one of the guys from the back of Snooky Young, well-known trumpet player, Snooky just kind of says, he says, I know one thing, you're late. He said, boy, he said, I know who you are. He said, I remember when you were no more than a conversation. He said, we go with Basie's band. He said, we did the gig. And B said, man, I'm going to go upstairs and get on that Georgia girl and go make me a son. He said, and here he is with his big old hair.
That's amazing.
Welcome to jazz. So we went down to Disneyland that night to do they did the gig, and he said, we'll do the interview backstage, do it on the bus. Basically just sat on the bus, sat backstage, just sort of catching up, how you been, what you and all that kind of stuff. And I told him, what my, high school journey had been at that point in my life. And he told me, hey man, we got back to the A&M lot that night. He said, come by my house tomorrow. He lived in Brentwood. I lived in Santa Monica. He said, come by the crib. He said, sometime around noon. He said, we'll sit out in the studio. We'll do the interview. I did. And we sat out in the studio for about 11 hours, never did do the interview, talked about everything under the sun, but the thing I was there to talk to him about. And so by the end of the day, when we'd had too much drink and too much to eat, he said, come on back tomorrow. So I did. I came back tomorrow, which is Sunday. I got there on Sunday around midday, same thing all over again, rinse, wash, and repeat. And by the time we had finished, I came to realize pretty quickly that while I was there to interview him, the truth of the matter was he was interviewing me, because he was, one of the things he sort of let me know is, he said this record was a change of direction from him, because Body Heat was the record where he decided he was no longer going to do the film composer thing. He was out of the TV scoring business, and that when he would go home at night, the music that he was listening to, because we're talking like 1973, 1974 now. So he was listening to Stevie, Earth, Wind & Fire, Rufus and Shaka, Ohio Players, Donny Hathaway, records like that. That was the stuff that he was listening to, that he was feeding off of in his soul. But when he was going in the studio making music, he was writing yet another arrangement of, a Basie tune or an Ellington tune or whatever. And he just felt he wasn't being true to his artistic soul. So he was getting ready to make some changes. And part of those changes were going to be that he was going to jettison his manager. His production partner at the time was the great Ray Brown, the bass player, that he was going to make some changes. And I realized he started picking my brain because I was a kid. I was 19, 20 years old. And with all the bravura and bravado that goes with that, I was ready to take over the world, And at the end of the 12 hours on Sunday, he said to me, hey man, he said, this record is just symbolic of where I'm going in my life. I'm going to make these moves. I'm going to really focus more on developing young talent, developing new talent. Would you be interested in coming to work for this production company? My company's going to morph into this production and record concern. And, me, who at that point was writing for Soul Magazine at, 8 cents a line and making, $1.58 pumping gas at the local Arco station. I thought about it for, a millisecond. Yeah, be in the office on Monday morning. And I turned up at his office at A&M on Monday morning. That was late summer 1973. Turned up at the office on Monday morning. It was he and I and a secretary at the time, assistant woman named Betty Gilmore. And 11 years later, I left, and it was, he and I, a bunch of employees and a bazillion Michael Jackson, Quincy Jones, Brothers Johnson, George Benson, Rufus and Chaka Khan, Wiz, Roots, fill in blank records later. It was an amazing tale.
I love how you talk about how he shedded his skin every few years. And then I also love that he knew to go to one of the young folks who was in the music to kind of help with launching this new foundation. How did he go about, first of all, finding artists? What was it like in terms of the talent, how he sought talent, and how he knew someone was it and that he wanted to work with them?
Well, the most immediate answer I could give would be, there's a few. I'll say the Brothers Johnson first, because the ones that I worked on there with him. He was working on the follow-up to Body Heat, which was an album called Mellow Madness. And there was a guitar player and a bass player who were to show up that day at the studio for the date, and they didn't show. And so he got frustrated because, he didn't have a guitar player and a bass player in the rhythm section for that day. And there was a background singer who was on the date, a guy called Joe Green. And Joe happened to mention to Quincy. He said, "Man, I know this young guitar player and bass player that you ought to hear. They'd be perfect for what you're trying to do today." He said, because Joe was a background singer with Billy Preston. And he said, Quincy said, "Yeah, who are they?" He said, "Do you know George and Louis Johnson?" And Quincy said, "No." He said, "Get him down here." He said, George and Louis came down and turned him out, played him a couple songs, played him what became the first single from the Mellow Madness record, "Is It Love That We're Missing?" And Jones' head exploded. And he said, "Oh my God, these guys are great." And I had been sent to Japan because the short of the very long was he was about to go tour Japan. And it was the first time he was going to go to Japan with the smaller version of the band, as opposed to orchestra. He was going to go with more of the, the sort of R&B-ish electronic, version of Quincy Jones, as opposed to big orchestra. So he sent me to Japan to cover the date, to advance the date, as it were, to advance the tour for the press and the record company and everything, and let him know what he was doing, because he had achieved godlike status over there, and he wanted to sort of, prime the pump and let everybody know what was happening. And I never forget, I was in Japan. I got a phone call. I detailed this on my liner notes on the back of the First Brothers record. I got a phone call from him. He was screaming in the phone, "Edward, you won't believe it." Each time he called me Edward, I knew what was up. It was something major. He spent and told me about these two guys that he'd found. And lo and behold, I came back to the States, and I don't know, a month later, we were doing some warm-up dates for the Japan tour. And I guess we were in Denver, was the first date of the tour. And Louis Johnson and I had just met each other, literally, and he was my roommate for that particular gig. And he was sitting in two queen-size beds in the room. He's sitting on his bed playing his bass, doing his thumping thing, his thumb thing. And I just kind of looked over at him. I said, "Negro, you got damn thunder." And he's like, "What?" I said, "You got thunder thumbs." Quincy, I said, "We're going to call him Thunder Thumbs." And John said, "Yeah, George will be Lightning Licks." And hence that's where their nicknames came from. But, he just loved the stuff. Other situations, Patty Austin, he'd known Patty since she was a little girl. Her story's not similar to mine. So he knew her as a little girl. Dinah Washington had turned him on to Diana Patty. And he knew he knew he was going to do something with Patty eventually. James Ingram came to us vis-a-vis. Quincy was working on The Dude in the early 80s, and he was looking for he was looking for songs for the Dude album, and got a call from a producer named Russ Titleman, who had just heard a song that was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil called "Just Once." And Quincy heard the song and loved it. So Russ said, "I heard the song, you love the song, Q." Russ is also a producer. He said, "You're going to love the song, Q." and he came by to see it. Played him the song, loved the song. But James was singing the demo. James did that. He was new in town at that point. He was making, $25 a session singing demos. So he sang the demo to Just Once, and Quincy absolutely loved his voice. He said, sing the demo. And Russ said, yeah, he's a kid called James Ingram. Apparently, he's an organ player. He's playing a gig with the Coasters. He's the organ player with one of the 97 Coasters spinoff groups. So he told me, he said, hey man, he said, I need you to go to some club in the Valley, some little club out here. He said, and go see this organ player, this kid, James Ingram. Tell him, I want him at the studio tomorrow at 3 or whatever. So I did, and turned up and said, hey man, I'm at Eckstine. I work for Quincy Jones, blah, blah, blah. Be at Westlake Audio tomorrow. Quincy Jones wants you at the studio, for a session. And James came to the studio completely thinking he was there to play keyboards. And when he came in, he said, where's the organ? Jones said, I don't want your organ. I want you to sing. James said, what? He said, sing just anything. He played the track Just Once. He had him sing it again. James nailed it in 2 takes. So that was the way that we came across an artist, Then I'm sure Saida told the story of how he had done a sort of cattle call audition of various in town, for this group that we were putting together at the time, a thing that he was doing called Deco. Saida was to be one of the members. Saida ultimately positioned herself as such, rose to the top to be one of the members of the group, along with Philip Ingram, James's younger brother, who had been in the band Switch, a guy called Kevin Dorsey, who sang with Michael Jackson for a while, another guy called Daryl Fennessy, who's a well-known session singer here in town. But yeah, just there are a plethora of ways that we'd come across stuff, and then ultimately, once his focus became solely developing a lot of new talent, the process became, people started coming to us,
I love this. And for you, your career has placed you at the seat of many celebrated music icons, from your father to Quincy Jones. Did knowing of their experiences and expectations help you face any career challenges?
Being raised by an artist in an artist environment certainly tainted, because as I said, dinner conversation and in our family household was show business, and obviously it was coming from Dad, so we're hearing it from an artist perspective, and artist perspective, with all due respect and love to my pops, is sometimes a tad skewed, I'll say polite.
You're being nice.
And one of the things that with Quincy that was always interesting to me was, I used to say when I first started working with, and like I said, I was just a pup at that point, I didn't know much, but one thing that I inherently sensed, it was that he was a highly evolved artist as businessman. One of the things I used to always say is that if Jones was in a room and there were 2 doors in the room, one door was marked business and one door was marked artist, 99 times out of 100, he'd go in and out of the artist door because that's who he was at his core. But the reality of it was he was always finely tuned to business, to what the business of a particular situation was that he was involved in, and because he used to have a line, he said, our constant battle is a battle between artistic credibility and commercial viability. And if you cross either one of those lines too, whatever, flagrantly, wantonly, if you do stuff that's too obviously trying to be commercial, it's going to tell on you. And if you do stuff that's too arty, you're not going to sell any records. So, but yeah, it certainly informed my my overall thinking. There was a point when I was in my corporate gig at Mercury, one of my corporate bosses used to like to sort of pick at me by calling me Ed Eckstine, the bleeding heart for the side of art. Out of decisions that were being made from the corporate perspective that I felt were sort of anti-artist or, detrimental to the artistic cause, I would always sort of raise my hand, not a good idea, stuff like that. So, yeah.
You had the perfect marriage between your dad on the talent side, Quincy on the business side and talent side. Mm-hmm. And then looking at your career, you had a Polygram's Wing Records with Miss America, Vanessa Williams. So I'm just curious, during that time with Vanessa Williams and what she was,
Mhm.
and what she was going through. How did that play a role in how you positioned her and positioned artists during that time?
Well, um, there was after I left Quincy, I went to work for Arista Records. I went to work for Clive Davis. Clive hired me as vice president of A&R.
Wow.
And that was like the Quincy experience was like going to a very, very well-heeled, high level private college or university. Um, Clive was like going to an Ivy League school. Um, and I had never really sort of experienced the corporate machinations per se, because there used to be an old E.F. Hutton commercial. When E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. Because when I was a kid, like I said, coming up work for Quincy, I was representing the biggest one in the game at that point. So, Quincy said, Quincy this, Quincy that. They would listen to me. I mistakenly thought that at a certain point, oh, they're listening to me. I must be bad. No, they're listening to you, kid, because you represent Quincy. But once you get getting in the Clive environment, I really sort of learned how the New York corporate record business worked, and I learned a great deal from Clive. Not to say that it didn't come with its inherent frustrations, but I learned a great deal. So ultimately, when the powers that be at Polygram came after me to come to work there, which became ultimately with the Wing Mercury situation, the latter period of my time with Arista, I knew I was leaving at that point. The deal had been worked out, but I knew I was going somewhere. Ramon Hervey, who was Vanessa's husband and / manager at the time, Ramon had been an old friend of mine. And I knew that at that point he had been out shopping. I call Vanessa V. Had been out shopping V to get her a deal somewhere. And everybody in town had taken meetings with him and her ultimately. But it was a bit more of a sort of an ogling situation. Oh, let's have her in here. We want to see Mr. Mary, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. Nobody was really taking the music seriously. But I had heard her on George Clinton's record, where she did the version of that song with Boosie, Do Fries Go With That Shake? And Hey Good Looking. And I said, this is cool. We can do something here. So Ramon came out of the office one day just to hang, and we were talking. I say, hey, man, how's it going? He told me what's going on. I said, well, look, on the low, I'm going to be leaving here shortly. I'm moving back home to LA. I was in New York at this point. I'm moving back home to LA, and I'm going to be starting a label for Polygram. I said, I'd be very interested in sit down, talking, and figure out what it is you want to do. My thought process, to be honest with you, was I could start a label with Susie Jones, someone that's a name that nobody knows, who could potentially be an artist that we could blow up and do whatever with. Or I could start a label with Vanessa Williams, a name that everybody knew at that particular point, but nobody knew what talent may or may not inherently be there. But that was my job to accomplish and to make it work. I was not a Miss America person per se, but I do recall vividly being at my mom's house the night that she won Miss America. And I was out in the yard doing something with the dogs or something. And I heard my mom scream from, oh my God, she won, the black girl won. My mom went buck wild. And I walked in the house as she was singing, doing the Streisand thing of Happy Days Are Here Again. So when I got back to LA, Ramon arranged a dinner, and the three of us went to dinner. And Vanessa at that point had sort of heard it all from everybody. And she looked at me as just another knucklehead, who was, there to, offer promises, but nothing, a lot of sizzle and no steak. So, we ended up talking. She came by the office the next day, and I started picking her brain about where she lived musically. And she's a woman from New York, and she grew up on WBLS. She grew up with Frankie Crocker. And so she loved Frankie. She loved BLS. She loved New York radio, and Jerry Bledsoe, those guys. So the Dixie Drifter, Hank's band. So she had really broad taste in music, and she had a bunch of cassettes in her car, the days when people used to make, custom cassettes for your car. And we were going somewhere, and I just took her cassettes out of her car. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm taking your tapes. What are you going to do with those? Taking them up my office and listen to them, because they'll give you a sense of where you are musically and what your breadth of taste, And her breadth of taste sort of went everywhere at that point, from funk to, Roberta Flack to Streisand to Tanya Maria, Brazilian stuff. She had a wide-ranging taste, which was interesting to me. So from that, I sort of formulated a sense of who it is, where I thought she lived musically. and we started to go down a road to make a record. And then probably, I'll just say for the sake of the conversation, 4 weeks into this process, she turns up in the office one day, and she was always sort of warm and nice to me, and we'd have a good time. She quickly sort of became baby sister. Um, and she kind of, and she was, I want to say, wasn't looking me in the eye, but was sort of looking all over the place when we were talking to me. I said, "What's up, V? What's going on?" "Oh, everything's cool." I said, "No, something's up. What's going on?" She goes, "You're going to be pissed." I said, "Why? What's up?" She says, "I'm pregnant." And I said, "Congratulations." So she was pregnant with she and Ramon's first child, Melanie. I said, "Congratulations." I said, "This is great." She says, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "I won't be able to make a record." I said, "It'll give us the time to incubate and take a little more time to figure out what we're going to do, et cetera, et cetera." And I think from that moment, that's really where our bond was sort of cemented, because it wasn't all about get the hell out of here, you got your pregnant ass. Uh, and that's where the relationship was born from.
I love that because, again, from your roots, starting with your dad, understanding the artist, and then working with Quincy as he shed his skin to start this branching out a new career, you clearly had a talent and a gift of recognizing that. And my other question is, when you're working with new artists, what was your signing process and was it influenced by Quincy? Did you kind of do the same thing you did with Vanessa, or did each artist have a customized type of process?
Well, the one thing that to answer the Quincy portion of it was Quincy's was always, it's all about the song. The bottom line, his thing was it's got to be about the song. Everything else is just sort of icing on the cake, imagery and all that stuff. It's all about, what are they going to, once you play the record, what are they going to walk away humming and singing, So first and foremost, it was always, regardless of who the act was, be it Vanessa, where we found who didn't write, where we found songs for her, in the old fashioned A&R sense, matchmaking with artists and repertoire A&R, or a band like, say, Tony, who I also signed and worked with, who wrote their own material, and had a very specific thing that they did to get to the core of what their material was, maintaining whatever the imagery was and the vibe was, but that also that there was a song there, because reality is, certainly a vibe, and you hear feels good, there's a song there. You hear Anniversary, Lay Your Head on My Pillow, the things that they, literally songs, that were sort of timeless, everything else around the Toniness of it was really sort of the icing on the cake, but there was song. So yeah, I mean, that the ultimate criteria is always like, what was the song? What are we going to sell to people? What are we going to get them to respond to?
And you've worked with, Tony, Vanessa Williams, Brian McKnight. Were there any artists that surprised you when you started working with them and getting a feel for who they were and their style? Was anyone of a surprise?
Surprise. I had an A&R guy named Sam Sapp. And Sam used to put cassettes on the passenger seat of my car for me to listen to when I was going home at night, because, I'd be sitting in evening traffic. And so this one particular evening, I just come home from vacation. I got in the car, plopped the tape in, and he said it was an 18-year-old kid from Buffalo, New York, via Orlando, Florida, who was a student at Oakwood College at that point, named Brian McKnight. His older brother was Claude McKnight of Take Six, and I was a big Take Six fan. At the time, Take Six had probably just put one record out at that particular moment, particular time. So I put the tape on, and it was Brian doing everything more or less, playing all the instruments. And the first track on it was a song that ended up being one of the first tracks on his album, called "The Way Love Goes." And a lot of the stuff that ended up on the first record ended up on Brian's, on the very first album, not One Last Cry, which was the first hit. But so I listened and loved it, and found out from Sam after talking to him that he had done a lot of work at the studio down in Huntsville, Alabama, with a producer down there called Doug Smith. And they were this close to a deal with Sony at that particular point, but the powers that be at Sony wanted him to be produced by Babyface or whoever, producer of the moment was. And I love Face's work. But, Brian is an artist and auteur in his own mind, rightfully so. He did not want to sort of end up in that sort of production gristmill. He wanted to do stuff himself. So I knew if I'm going to win this card game, that's the card I got to play. So as I said to him, I said, look, man, I want to see you to sort of execute whatever your vision is here. And it'll be on us to sort of make it happen from there. But I'm going to ask you to make this promise to me that once we're two albums in, if it hasn't worked that way, allow me the opportunity to bring in somebody to work with you, moving forward. He said, cool. And we did. And that was the first record. And the first record came, and we had a hard time getting him arrested, as they say, after the first record. It took us almost a year and a half to 2 years to get that record started, because it was at a time where romantic balladeers were not necessarily in fashion, in vogue at the time. Everything was sort of hip hop based. Brian was certainly a throwback. He was really, of his own way, he was kind of contemporary of my father's era, my father / Stevie / Donnie. And we, like I said, promoters weren't booking him, for tours. We just really had a hard time getting it on the radio. And particularly too, when we decided to go with One Last Cry, because, it was a really sort of, stark ballad. And Brian had sort of gone through a few permutations of recording it. And the thing that I kept hearing in my head was, I heard that song pretty much as it was, just keyboards, vocal, and the guitar solo in the middle, no drums. And, and a record, you got to get started at black radio with no drums. What, are you kidding? Good luck with that, brother. But, in my heart of hearts, I knew that record had sort of an ambient, ethereal feel to it, in order to let the song breathe, let the sentiment breathe, and let him do his thing. Of a different order, it was kind of She's Out of My Life. That was really what was sort of the driving force that I was hearing in the back of my head. That sense of emotion that Michael emitted in She's Out of My Life was not dissimilar to what One Last Cry was about. So we ultimately, that's where the record company really kicked in, or being in charge, being an A&R guy. There was a classic Eddie Murphy line from, I guess, 48 Hours, maybe Beverly Hills Cop, when somebody says to him, when he's with Nick Nolte, he says, "What are you?" He says, "I'm your worst fucking nightmare. I'm a nigga with a..." In my case, I was your worst nightmare. I was an A&R guy who was the president of a record company. So, stuff that normally could get shot down, because he was my artist and I had a certain vision for him. I could make it happen because I was, I was the leader of the troops, as it were.
Wow.
So one of the things that we did was, my artist development department, there was a guy there then named Bobby Duckett. And Bobby had worked for Hush Productions for years, Freddie Jackson and Lilo Thomas and a number of the artists who were at Hush. Jackie Reinhardt knew Duckett real well. I think Jackie was on this call at some point. And Bobby, one of the things that Bobby came to me and said, "Look, man, the major promoters aren't biting on Brian. We can't get him out there. We need to just get him on the road." One of the things that we found as a record company was, when we were setting up his record, what we did was we'd go into different markets, bring in all the retail people, bring in a lot of radio people, take over a penthouse suite in a hotel, the grand piano, and just let Brian sit at the piano, do a cocktail party kind of thing, sit down at the piano and just start playing his songs. And we noticed it reverberated resonated immediately, both male and female. Women reacted to him, and men reacted because women reacted. That brother's soft. They saw how the girl reacted. "Oh, I like this." So it was on like that. So one of the things that we realized was that we just got to get him in front of people. And one of the ways we decided, it was Bobby's idea actually, was he said, man, he said, the promoters won't bite. He said, but you know how after every major show in town, there's always the after party at the Marriott Marquis or whatever that the so-and-so, the local street promoter in town, puts on. He said, let's do stuff with the street promoters. Let's create them as our promoter network. The real so-called big boys won't mess with our boy, but let's throw a bone to the B team here. Maybe it'll elevate them. And so we did. And Brian started doing a lot of those kind of gigs. I always remember that there was a point where he called me from the road. He was a very soft, he still was a very soft-spoken kid at that point. He was like 19 years old. He called me. I said, "Where are you, man?" He said, "I'm in Montgomery, Alabama." I said, "How's it going?" He said, "It's cool." He said, "Where's the gig tonight?" He said, "I'm playing a barbecue joint." It's kind of quiet and silent on the other end. Why the hell y'all got me in a barbecue joint? And I knew Montgomery because my daughter's mother was from Montgomery. I'd been down there a bunch, and I knew the barbecue joint. And he said, "I'm playing a barbecue joint." And he was doing a promotion for whatever the station is in the market. I forgot now. And And later on that night, he called me. I said, "How was the show, man?" He said, "Dude," he said, "we're sold out, blah, 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 blah." I said, "Geez, barbecue while you're placing?" Yeah, man. He says, "Weird scene one last Friday." And somebody walking by with a tray of ribs. Market that he went to, that was sort of the end story. There'd be something that happened in one of those markets, after it was all said and done, that reacted. It's like it was artist development, the good old fashioned way. And we were fortunate too, just to backtrack a little bit, Vanessa, this similar tale, because Brian, like I said, just very humble. The music kind of sold him. And in Vanessa's case, obviously the infamy created an awareness with certain people, but her ability to sell, because part of my attitude was that if she could sell her Miss Americaness to the junior leagues throughout America, to white America, convincing black radio to put a record on, if we made the right record, was not going to be that big a problem. And then we did a promotion tour with her, Michael Johnson, who was our head of promotion at the time. She and Michael went on the road with our local staff, and she would go into all the markets and do the afternoon drive shows or whatever, and the brothers who were on the radio more often than not in the afternoon show, we're happy to have her there. And she just had a way of sort of commanding presence, of taking over the room, which at the station, if somebody was asking the same sort of generic questions, she would cut him off and say, "Yeah, I don't want to hit these same stupid questions. I bet you want to know about so-and-so, and the phones would start lighting up. And when the right stuff went on and Dreaming, phones lit up and, it was on. So artist development, that was, as much as making the right record, it was really all about getting out there and positioning it and shaping it for the marketplace.
Wow. I could talk to you all day. I'm fascinated. I'm just fascinated.
Thank you.
So my last question for you, although I wish we had about 5 more episodes with you, but word on the street is that you're working on a project about your dad, Billy Eckstine. So tell us more, and when we'll be able to see it.
Well, it's been in motion for a while. It's a documentary about my dad, his life, his music, and his social activism, just, and who he was as pops. We've been in production with it for a few years now. The director called Kevin Swain, although we're having some conversations with some money people, about broadening it a bit. And it's early stages, although we've been working on it for a minute, but it's one of these situations that when we get a certain influx of cash, things will start to move along pretty quickly. And we've already shot some pretty good, significant interviews. We've shot Quincy, because Quincy and my dad were very close from the time Quincy was a kid. When he was 13, 14 years old, he used to turn up at my dad's gigs up in Seattle with the big band, with an armload of arrangements under his arm, waiting to try to get to Bobby or various musicians in the band so he could show them the arrangements that he'd written. And the story they always told is they always wondered, when did Quincy go to school? Because he'd be there when the band got to the gig at 4:00 in the afternoon, and he would stay there till 2:30 in the morning after the gig was over. So Quincy, George Benson, because my dad's from Pittsburgh and Benson's Pittsburgher, and Dad was functionally the first sort of star to emerge from Pittsburgh music. George and my dad had a special friendship. President Jimmy Carter. President Carter was a big fan of Dad's. He tells the story that when he and Miss Rosalind's first dates was to see Billy Eckstine, and I guess it was in Macon, and he used to call the house periodically when we were kids.
Really?
You asked if Eckstine resident, "May I speak to Mr. B, please?" He said, "Who's called Jimmy Carter?" And then when he ran, Dad, Jimmy Carter's on the phone, whoever Jimmy Carter was. And when he ran for president, I remember my younger brother guy and I looked at, wait a minute, that dude? Yeah, so President Carter, Willie Mays did an interview for us, which was cool. And a few others, and obviously a lot of the people of his generation have passed. So we're dealing with a lot of sort of archived footage in order to make it happen. But yeah, that's what's going on there.
That's going to be so good. And Ed, this has been amazing. And I'm so appreciative that you joined us, and I have enjoyed every single moment of this. Now, tell us where we can find you on social media, websites, where people can find you.
I'm on Instagram. I'm kind of low key on the Luddite issues in the early part of the day notwithstanding, you can generally find me. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok.
Okay.
You know,
And what's your handle on Instagram and TikTok?
at Eckstine.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
That sounds good.
Oh, actually,
Well,
Instagram. I'm Too Easy Ease.
too easy.
EWEZE''S.
Okay. Okay, that's perfect. Well, I'd like to thank all of our listeners for joining us today, and be sure to subscribe on that button down on your left. Like, comment, we'll be sure to respond. And most importantly, thank you for joining us, Ed.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Nice to meet you as well.
Same.
Music Day, a verified hit. Real talk with experience. Executive producer, Jacqueline Reinhardt, Pat Shields, Ken Johnson, and Mark Hill. The associate producers are Tony Winger, Sheila Eldridge, and Shannon Henderson. Talent booking, Black Dot LLC. Production by Mark Hill Creative and Mean Old Lion Media. I'm your announcer, Jay Johnson. This has been a Living Legends Foundation, Inc. production. Find out more about the Living Legend Foundation, Inc. or donate to livinglegendsfoundation.com.